I can't hear you. I don't know if you can hear me. Oh, there we go. I think I can hear you now.
Hello?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Yeah, hopefully you're not echoing. I had a little audio problem, so I just switched to my laptop here. Is everything okay?
Yeah, it seems all right now.
Awesome. Well, first of all, thank you so much for joining me. I'm, of course, very excited to talk to you. I think a lot of people in my community are probably familiar with your work. They've definitely heard me talk about the Daily Gwei. It's just a great resource every morning to catch up on Ethereum. Just to get started, do you mind giving a brief background of how you got into this space and just what you're working on now?
Yeah. Just to keep it brief, I guess I first discovered Bitcoin in 2013. Kind of jumped down the rabbit hole then, but kind of I guess left the space when the market kind of crashed. Like NT Gox went down, Bitcoin price went down. Kind of left the market till around early 2017 when I discovered Ethereum. Kind of got involved with the community then. I guess what I did was I basically lurked a lot in 2017. There wasn't really any Twitter going on. It was mostly Reddit, so kind of just lurked Reddit for a while. I wasn't really doing anything. I was working like a job that wasn't in crypto or anything like that. And then into 2018, obviously the bear market hit, but I decided to stick around this time, start building myself up, launched a weekly newsletter in early 2018, kind of built myself up through 2018 on Twitter, launched ETH end of, really the beginning of 2019, but we had the podcast and newsletter going end of 2018. Joined Set mid 2019 and kind of like worked there as product marketing manager for a while. Then into 2020, kept doing that. Launched the Daily Gwei mid 2020, and then left Set early 2021 and launched Daily Gwei YouTube late 2020. The newsletter was mid 2020, and then I've just been doing a bunch of different kind of things. These days, basically, do a bunch of different things, like heaps of different things, like all across the Ethereum ecosystem. So I guess I don't work for any one company. I'm not employed by any one company. I kind of just work for myself now. But essentially, just trying to give back to the community where I can. That's why I do the Daily Gwei. It's all free and everything, and basically helping a bunch of different teams within the ecosystem. That's like a brief background.
Awesome. And just out of curiosity, I love hearing how people got into cryptocurrency. So, what was your on ramp there? Did you buy Bitcoin first, straight to Ethereum?
Yeah. So it's funny because in 2017, the exchange that I use in Australia didn't actually support ETH. They only had Bitcoin on there. So I bought Bitcoin and then went and then traded it for ETH. But I also, I mean, obviously, as I said, I got into Bitcoin in 2013 and ETH wasn't around back then. So that was the first crypto that I bought, had exposure to. So when I came back in 2017, I already knew kind of like the ropes. I knew what to do. I knew how to handle with, wallets and exchanges. And I haven't really held Bitcoin in any material amount since I discovered ETH. Like it's just always been ETH, and I mean DeFi tokens as well and things like that. But yeah, definitely was Bitcoin originally, and then all in on ETH.
Awesome. So, just right off the bat, I do want to jump into it. I think a lot of the big criticism you face is that you're, the term ETH maximalist. Do you have any thoughts on that? But more importantly, are there any other chains that you're even intrigued by? Is there anything else you're looking at and think, oh, well, that's cool. There's some great developments happening there. Maybe Ethereum can bring that in, or maybe that chain has some potential in the future.
Yeah, it's funny because I think the maximalist term has kind of lost most of its meaning at this point. I think the way I look at like someone who's a maximalist, it's kind of like obviously it was spawned out of by Vitalik and was used to describe Bitcoin maximalists who thought that every other project was a scam, it was useless, it had no value, and we should just focus on Bitcoin. I don't think that way about Ethereum at all. I don't think every other project is a scam. I don't think that we should only focus on Ethereum. But when I have limited time in a day and when so much is happening within the Ethereum ecosystem, I really can't afford time-wise to spend too much time in other ecosystems. Like I do have like a cursory view of it and everything like that. But I don't kind of like see value in spending my time in other ecosystems when my whole brand is Ethereum too, right? And what I enjoy doing is Ethereum. Ethereum to me basically has all the values and the mission statement that I want, like fully, sticking to the decentralization ideals, not giving that up to achieve kind of like short-term scale or to take shortcuts or trade-offs or anything like that. So for me, I guess like you could say I'm a decentralization maximalist if you wanted to say that. And I kind of think that anything that isn't really decentralized is not something that I'm too interested in when it comes to other blockchains. For example, BSC, definitely really not interested in BSC. Kind of like definitely have a big problem with that. But yeah, there's a bunch of other chains as well that do that sort of stuff. But in saying that, there's definitely a lot of cool tech being built in other chains, and there's definitely tech that Ethereum is using or is going to use that has been developed on other blockchains or in other ecosystems. So I don't think it's like a zero-sum thing where you have to be, into Ethereum and then everything that comes out of Ethereum is like the best and you can't adopt any other technologies. I think that's what happens in Bitcoin land, where they think that basically anything that happens in other technologies are just going to get absorbed into Bitcoin, which hasn't happened like at all at this point. So, and I think that with Ethereum, like we have other chains bridging into Ethereum and Ethereum bridging out to other chains. And I think that's just healthy overall for the ecosystem. I don't think it's just going to be a mono chain world where it's just Ethereum and that's it. I do think it's going to be a multi-chain kind of world, but in saying that, there won't be like a million different chains. It'll be like a handful and like be like a power law distribution where most of the activity is centered around, I believe, Ethereum, and then you'll have everything kind of like branching off of Ethereum for various different reasons. And obviously Ethereum's layer 2 ecosystem can be considered different chains as well. Even though they inherit their security from Ethereum, they essentially are another blockchain, if you want to think about it like that, just secured by Ethereum. So that's kind of how I view it. And yeah, I mean, I'm used to being called an ETH maxi at this point. I think, as I said, it's lost its meaning. So I think it's more of a joke now. It's just an easy kind of thing to describe someone as. But yeah, I wouldn't consider myself like a traditional maximalist, right? Someone who thinks everything else is a scam.
Gotcha. And I should mention now, we are taking questions from the audience. So if you have a question, I see one here that I think is great. I'm just going to highlight it. Basically, the summary of that question is, how do you make sure that you're participating ethically with all of the influence that you have? I think, a great example of this is just this morning or for me in the morning on the Daily Gwei. You were talking about all the opportunities you get to invest in great projects. So one I think is like very interesting to talk about is Polygon. Obviously, there's a lot of criticism there of whether it's centralized or not, what their plans are in the future, and how it can compete with true L2s. So is that something you're okay touching on? Just how, if you have any frameworks that you use just to make sure you're investing ethically and always doing what's best for the Ethereum community, I would say.
Yeah, for sure. I'm happy to talk about that. So yeah, I guess I take it very seriously, of course. I mean, I noticed last night I crossed over 100,000 Twitter followers, and I was kind of looking at it and I was like, wow, this is a lot of people, right? Like, yeah, okay, there's some bots and stuff in there, but like still, I know that I have a lot of influence. I know that I have a reach, and I know that people will look at what I say and what I do and kind of like judge me based on that in kind of like at scale. And I totally get that. And I being kind of like who I am and being a decentralization maximalist and someone who really believes in the mission of Ethereum, I take the ethics around that incredibly seriously. So, you'll notice that on the refuel, I always disclose whenever I'm an investor in something or an advisor to a project. And even if I've disclosed it before, I make a note to disclose it again for any new viewers or listeners or anything like that, to make sure that they know that even though I try my best to get my bias for a project out of how I'm talking about it, I still obviously have an unconscious bias because I'm involved with the project or I have a monetary stake in it. But Polygon's a good example because Polygon is definitely something that's come under a lot of scrutiny lately, and rightly so. Like I'll be honest, like I don't blame people for scrutinizing the multi-sig on the bridge, for example. That was originally it was I don't know if it was a 2 of 3, but something that was really insecure, where there was billions of dollars on that bridge, and only a handful of people could kind of come together and collude if they wanted to and steal the funds. Now, the multi-sig, I think right now is a 5 of 8 or maybe a little bit more than that, where you could still have these people come together, collude and steal the funds if they wanted to. That is definitely an attack vector. So I totally get people kind of criticizing that, and I agree with them. Like, and it's funny because I have to, like, it's a bit difficult for me at times with Polygon because I have to tread the fine line of not outright like kind of shitting on Polygon since I'm working with them, but also telling the truth. So, and I never referred to Polygon's PoS chain as a layer 2. I always referred to it as a side chain. But I know that in their marketing, they sometimes refer to it as layer 2. I think that was a communications thing at the end of the day. Yeah. I don't think there was any ill intent there. But definitely, I have to be careful about what I say, what I do, make sure that I don't get involved in any shady projects. As you said, like I get a lot of opportunities to invest in different projects, and I've invested in over 20 at this stage, at the seed or Series A stage, and pretty much all of them are legitimate projects. A lot of them are well known within the community and loved by the community and everything like that. So I ensure that I'm not investing in any dodgy projects, and I'm not advising any dodgy projects either. Like I've had tons of projects come at me, like all the time and saying, hey, can you advise us? You want to invest in us? And I say no to so many because it's not ethically right. Like, even if I could make money from it, I couldn't live with myself if I did that. I am not someone who's a profit maximalist who wants to make money at everyone's expense. I'm actually in it for the tech, believe it or not, but I'm for people out there, but I'm here to like educate and make sure that I can make money to sustain myself so that I can do that on my own. Like, having the freedom to basically, live the way I live and work on what I want to work on allows me to give that all back to the community. So yeah, there's definitely a fine line to tread, and it can be difficult at times, as I mentioned with the Polygon stuff. But I think that as long as I stay true and I make sure I don't kind of like try and lie to people or bullshit my way out of anything, I think people really resonate and respect that.
Awesome. Thank you. Switching gears a bit, this is a question I think about a lot, and I think I have a few answers in my head that I'm working on. But what do you currently think is the biggest threat to Ethereum right now?
That's a good question. So I think the biggest threat to Ethereum is definitely that no one would care about decentralization. That might be one of the, if not the biggest threat out there. We've already seen kind of like the early signs of this with the BSC ecosystem, for example, where a lot of people came into it because they just wanted to make money. They were newer people and they didn't want to pay the high fees. I'm not saying that's a bad thing. I totally get why people would want to do that. But it does bring into question. It's like, okay, how much are we paying a premium for decentralization on Ethereum? Like, will people pay that premium? Do they care enough? How many people care? I think there's like different groups of people. I think first timers into this ecosystem, at least a lot of them are in it for the money, and that's totally fine. I mean, I was in it for the money when I first got into crypto. I think as a first timer and as you get started, you start being in it for the money, and then slowly you learn more about the tech, and then kind of like you get more interested in the tech, and then you realize over time you're like, okay, well, if this tech's going to actually work and do what it's supposed to do, it needs to be decentralized, and then you kind of like fall down that rabbit hole there. So I would think that would be the biggest threat, but I think it's funny because as much as I say it's the biggest threat, I don't think it's a major one, because I think that users will follow developers, and developers are the ones who actually do care about decentralization, at least all the ones doing the pioneering work. And there's a reason why a lot of them won't deploy to BSC directly, or if they do, it's basically a business decision where it's like, okay, we have to deploy here because if we don't, we'll get forked, and then someone else will deploy us there, and sort of thing. And users will follow those developers because those are the ones developing the apps. So I think from that point of view, as long as developers care about decentralization, we have a counterweight to users not caring too much about it. But also, it's like insurance. You don't care about it till something bad happens. Then you're like, I really want it. So if something bad happens on a centralized kind of platform, you're like, oh, wow, I didn't know this was centralized, or maybe I should have used something that was decentralized because now I've lost my money or whatever, or anything like that. We've seen tons of that within Ethereum and crypto, like rug pulls and things like that, where things aren't decentralized. So I think people learn from that over time, and I also think that the ecosystem having like number 1 and 2 being Bitcoin and Ethereum is pretty healthy, because of the fact that those two communities, even though they disagree on a lot of things, they both care deeply about decentralization, and that kind of permeates throughout the ecosystem. So I think it's really great that we have such large communities kind of extolling that vision on the rest of the community.
Awesome. Yeah, so the next questions I prepared are basically just to dig a bit deeper in what I personally think are some of the biggest threats. So just right off the bat, I talked to Nick Carter on a Twitter Spaces once. He's a very intelligent person. He's very much so on the Bitcoin side, but I still love listening to what he has to say and whatnot. And one of the things we were talking about is just the centralization risk that Coinbase staking poses, Lido staking, and then, of course, Binance staking poses. Just the other day, I think I heard you on a Daily Gway mention that CZ at Binance tried to actually reverse the Ethereum a transaction.
No, it was Bitcoin, and it was a little while ago where where Binance was hacked. There was I don't know how much of Bitcoin it was, and then he floated the idea on Twitter about reorging the chain so that we could basically, delete that attack and basically reverse the transactions there. Yeah, so it was Bitcoin, but nothing ever happened. It was just CZ floating an idea that he immediately realized was really dumb, and he kind of backtracked on it.
But just diving, so I think the similar thing could apply to ETH with proof of stake in the merge after the merge. But like, let's assume a Coinbase or a Binance or Lido has like a very substantial or a majority position where they're just controlling the most validators and have decisions over the network. Let's just assume like if Binance gets hacked, who knows what could happen, right? Is there any risk there, or how are we mitigating against that potential risk of validator centralization?
Yeah, so this is something that I've written about on my newsletter before, and I've talked about a lot generally. I think when looking at these sorts of things in centralization and of consensus mechanisms or centralization of stake or hash power, anything like that, I think what people kind of miss when you look at the surface level stuff is that at the end of the day, these technologies are social technologies. Even if people don't want to admit it, it's run by people. The only reason it's decentralized is because thousands of people are running their full nodes, keeping track of the current state of the chain, and ensuring that any kind of wrongdoing is called out or any kind of like bugs or exploits are called out. So from that perspective, I think the same applies no matter if it's proof of stake or proof of work, where as long as you have a really strong social layer, you have a really strong blockchain. And Vitalik's written about this before. He's put it way more eloquently than I'll be able to put it. But essentially, in case of an attack, do you have the social layer? Do you have the people, the community to fight back against that, to deal with the attacker? If you don't, then the attacker can get away with it. It's like, for example, if like an army attacks your little village, you don't have another army to kind of like defend against it, right? Your village is going to get wiped off the face of the earth. But if you're another city and you have your own army, well, you can defend against it. You can defend against attacks, and you can try your best and make sure that you survive. So I think the same kind of applies to these blockchains. Now, if you want to talk specifically about centralization of stake on exchanges, I did write a piece about this. I'm just remembering what I wrote in that piece. It was along the lines of the fact that there's a few different attacks you can do with specifically with proof of stake. And I mean, it works in proof of work, but it's a bit different in proof of stake, where you can do like censorship attacks, where you can do this in proof of work too, but with 33% of the network, I think in Ethereum's proof of stake, you can kind of censor transactions. That would immediately get called out and spotted by the community. So that is a social kind of defense mechanism that we have in that, because so many people are watching the chain and paying attention to it, that would be called out. And these exchanges have a reputation. So if they did anything, what do you think is going to happen to the stake on their exchanges? People are going to remove their stake, right? They're going to basically go to another exchange or go somewhere else, or basically stop staking. There's legal ramifications for these exchanges. I know that we shouldn't rely on the legal system for kind of like the security of the chain, but that doesn't matter because they're still regulated regardless if they're kind of staking or not. So that, and then they have like investors to answer to, especially something like Coinbase that is now public. Could you imagine them doing that and then that coming out and then the press that they would get for that? That would be absolutely horrible. So I don't want to kind of say that this is proof of kind of like PR sort of thing, proof of good PR, but there's the incentives to attack the chain for these exchanges are just not there at all. And the incentives for them to collude are even less, because Coinbase and Binance are not going to collude on their own. They're competitors. Why would they collude to take down the Ethereum network? I just don't see a reason for that to happen. Now, if you talk about things like, oh, well, what if a nation state comes along and says and forces Binance and Coinbase to do stuff on the network that they wouldn't do on their own? And that's another whole issue there. That's when the actual mechanisms in place on the chain, like stake slashing, like the social consensus comes into it, where if we see an attack happening, we can essentially slash the attacker. And if they have the majority of the stake, what we actually can end up doing is we can fork them out in the worst case scenario. We can basically come together as a community and say, okay, well, this person or these validators are acting badly. Yes, they're the majority of the network because of this, and this, but we're gonna start we're gonna fork the chain as and we're gonna go start with something else basically, and we're gonna fork these attackers out. Now that is obviously messy. I'm making it sound way easier than it is, but that is the worst case scenario. And forking, it's kind of like what happened with Ethereum Classic, for example. Right. I know that was much more controversial, but that's kind of what happened there. So it can happen, and it would happen, I think, in that scenario. So I think it's a concern to the extent that everyone should be staking on their own if they can, if they have that 32 ETH minimum to stake. And also taking advantage of the services that aren't exchanges. Like there's Lido, which allows you to distribute your stake across different staking providers. And exchanges are in their own class, I think, and they just make it super easy for people to stake. But I think we do have counterbalances and counterweights to kind of protect ourselves against attacks at the social layer in the worst case, and at the kind of like consensus layer in the best case, where we can just slash these actors, and then once you get slashed, you're basically kicked out of the validator queue as well. So you're validator set. So essentially, your validator just stops. It's not part of the consensus anymore, and you've lost like a certain amount of ETH depending on what you did. So you either have to buy more ETH to rejoin as a validator, which takes a little bit of time, or you just give up on the attack. And that's where I think there's a massive advantage of proof of stake, is that with proof of work, you can't do that. You can't burn down the mining farm, right? For example, you actually have to deal with it. And if someone is constantly attacking the chain, Vitalik calls it a spawn camp attack. What ends up happening is that if you try to fork out those miners, you have to change the hashing algorithm. But what happens when you change the hashing algorithm is you fork out all the good miners as well. So you would somehow need to do it in such a way where you can actually get some good miners to continue the chain, but it would be incredibly disruptive. And with proof of stake, you don't have to do that, because you just slash the attacker's ETH. Everyone else's ETH is still fine, well and good. You don't have to change the hashing algorithm, and everything continues on as normal. So yeah, I think there's a few different defense mechanisms we have in there that are really, really strong. And the final defense mechanism is always the social layer, which I think Ethereum has, a very strong one for sure.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. It is interesting when people come to me and they say, well, I want a very safe yield on ETH, like that's all I want to hold, and maybe they're not technically savvy. I'm happy to tell them to go to Coinbase, but I always have that mixed feeling of like, it is best for them and it's very safe and secure. It's a publicly traded company in the US, but it does in some ways go against what everyone is trying to build. But I think that's a conversation for another day. So moving on to the next question, it's obviously a very hot topic right now. MEV, miner extractable value. Could you give just a very brief overview of what that actually is, and then what are some of the proposed solutions that are potentially being worked on to solve some of those problems?
Yeah. So MEV obviously has been a hot topic in the ecosystem for a little while now. I think it's always been around. The funny thing about MEV is that it exists everywhere. It's basically the notion that people in the know can extract value for people not in the know. Like, that's the simplest way of putting it. So as an example, if you're doing a trade on Uniswap and you get front run by someone who's extracting MEV, essentially what they do is that they make you pay a little bit more for your order, essentially. And that's where price impact comes into things. There's slippage, and then there's price impact. Price impact is basically essentially, you'll sell into the market. Of course, you'll make a price impact, but or buy into the market or whatever, or buy into a coin. But if someone buys before you, they essentially put the price up by a little bit, right? Depending on the transaction, and then you end up paying more, and then they kind of like sell into the market because they've essentially, you've pushed the price up a little bit more yourself, and that's how they've extracted the value. And that's kind of like front running, which is at the heart of MEV. And you wouldn't, like, as a regular user, you wouldn't even know that's happened. But the people that are in the know and running the MEV bots and running the scripts and things like that know what they're doing, and that's the advantage that they have. And that exists in traditional finance as well. It's just, it's not open. It's more of it's not a regulated thing, but it's more of a permission thing, where, for example, Robinhood will sell customer order flow to big funds so that they can use that information to trade or to market make or to do whatever with. And it exists on centralized exchanges too. So it's not a unique to Ethereum problem. But the reason why people kind of like, I think, say it's an issue for Ethereum is because miners are the ones extracting the value. And when miners are the ones getting involved in extracting the value, because they're also involved with consensus, it can possibly lead to a destabilization of the consensus mechanism. And this is what we've seen someone called Edgar talk a lot about on Twitter, about basically giving the miners an ability to constantly reorganize the chain and essentially to basically fight each other for the MEV. So say some miner sees another miner kind of extract $1 million of MEV. Then like, oh wait, I want that MEV. So what the other miner does is they attempt to reorg the chain or reorg that block so that they can actually steal that MEV opportunity from the other miner. And what the, I guess, worst case scenario would be is just a constant loop of miners fighting each other for this kind of MEV, and then the chain would never progress. That is, I've spoken about that at length on the refuel. I'm sure you heard me speak about that there, so I won't cover that now. That is, in my opinion, a very far-fetched and unlikely scenario to happen because of everything I just outlined about the social layer, and kind of everything like that. But also, miners have an incentive, direct incentive, not to mess with the chain, because then the ETH price will fall and their revenues are going to fall anyway. So even if they get like a little bit of short-term MEV, they lose out on the long-term kind of profits or the longer-term profits from that. So yeah, that's kind of like a basic overview. Hopefully that is easy for people to understand. But essentially, there's a few proposed solutions out there. One of them is this notion of democratizing access to MEV, essentially allowing anyone to do MEV through something called flash bots. So This is some software that miners run, and then you can use the Flashbot service to essentially directly go to miners with your transactions and say, "Hey, I want to put this transaction into a block because it's extracting MEV. Can you do this for me? And I'll pay you like a bribe to do it, essentially." And that's what ends up happening. They'll put the transaction into a block. It'll have a zero GUI fee because miners can put whatever transactions they want into a block themselves. And that's kind of like the democratization of access. Now, a lot of people are criticizing this, saying that it's still a problem. Like, just because you've democratized access to it doesn't mean it's not a problem anymore. Like, it doesn't matter who's doing the MEV extraction. Really, at the end of the day, end users are still kind of like paying the price of this. And obviously, it's worse if miners are doing it directly. Well, technically, miners are doing it directly now. They could easily just include their own transactions instead of transactions coming from other people through the Flashbots software. So that is kind of like one solution that I don't really think is a solution. It's more of a band-aid. But the Flashbots team isn't just kind of like doing that sort of stuff. They're working on a bunch of other ways to mitigate MEV. But I don't think MEV can ever be eliminated completely. And I'll get back to that, actually. I wanted to name a couple of other ways people are kind of researching this. There's kind of research going into how do we randomize transactions within a block so that if transaction ordering was randomized, the miners couldn't essentially dictate which transactions go first, which go last, all this sort of thing, which they won't include or stuff like that. So that there's a lot of work being done there. And there's a bunch of work being done about like making the transactions private as well. So basically with ZK Snark's technology, still very far away. Justin Drake's spoken about this a lot on the Bankless podcast, but essentially it would mean that you could do a Uniswap trade and no one would know what that trade was. And that by not knowing, it means that there can't be any MEV extracted. Now, I read a comment as I was saying before. It's all about MEV minimization. I don't think you can totally eliminate MEV because I read a comment from Vitalik the other day who put it quite well, where he said MEV is actually not bad. It's just as I said, the notion of extracting value. Now, think about arbitrage between different transactions, different exchanges. Is that MEV? Is the fact that someone can profit from selling it higher on one exchange and buying it lower on another exchange, or vice versa? Is that bad MEV? Well, no. That's how these AMMs function on Ethereum that have different liquidity pools. That's how their prices stay in sync. They get arbitrage, and the same thing happens on centralized exchanges. But that is a form of MEV. So that is something that we obviously don't want to remove. We don't want to make impossible to do because we need the arbitrage bots to do that to keep the markets running. So there's, the work that's being done is all being done to minimize the amount of MEV and its negative externalities on end users, not MEV itself, but like making sure that end users aren't the ones footing the bill and footing the massive bills and can't get like attacked, essentially. There's this concept of a sandwich attack, which is pretty brutal. I mean, it's got to do with what I was saying before about how the attacker can push the price of an asset up, force you to buy in at a higher price, and then sell back and essentially, sandwich you. You're in the middle. You're getting squashed by the MEV extractors transactions. So hopefully that gives a little bit of an overview there of what's happening. It's a very kind of complex space. It's definitely attracted some of the brightest minds in the industry to work on it. So I think that we'll get to a point where we minimize it enough that it doesn't hurt end users too much, but it's definitely a very big problem. Not problem, but a very big kind of like space, and lots of new research needs to go into it.
Sure. Yeah, no, I appreciate that. And just for everyone that's watching live and commenting, I do see all these great questions. Before I get into that, I do just want to kind of get through some of the most important ones that I had for Anthony. So next up, I think is somewhat of a unique thing that I haven't heard others bring up, but one of the things I've been kind of just pondering and wondering is if deflationary ETH is not necessarily a great thing if we want to grow DeFi and just increase volume on this space. Just to preface that with the basic economic reasoning, in the US, we set a goal of about 2% inflation, and economists basically agree with that and say that pushes people to spend more today. Just the intuitive example, if I had $1 million today, if I know that's going to be worth more in 10 years, maybe I just hold that. I don't spend it. I don't buy a car or a house. I just wait until I can actually buy more in the future. So with ETH, obviously with 1559 and the merge happening, ETH is expected to be deflationary after the merge. Do you think there's any economic risk here that people will just say, well, the supply is going down, the price is probably going to go up, I'm not going to pay for transactions? Before you get into that, one of the counters I've heard is, well, you're going to make this transaction, you're going to execute it and pay for it as long as it's worth more than the price of the transaction. You're going to make that calculation in your head. But to me, I don't think that's a complete answer, just because there's so many transactions on the fringe where you might say, well, I wanted to buy this NFT, but I don't want to spend ETH purchasing that. Or I was going to switch to a stable coin and do a stable coin yield farm, but I can't really afford to possibly spend my ETH if it's deflationary. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, this is something that comes up a lot. And I think the problem is that I think people still view ETH as a currency, or as like a currency that's going to be used worldwide to replace fiat. I don't view ETH as that, as a start, and I don't view BTC as that either. What I view ETH as is basically a collateral asset. Essentially, at the core of what ETH is, it is, in my opinion, the world's best store of value programmable collateral asset. I know there's a bunch of buzzwords in there, but that's what I believe it is. I believe that because of it's not a currency, it can be a money without being a currency. I think that's what another confusing thing people kind of get into. A good currency, one that actually works quite well for an economy, is generally stable, which obviously ETH isn't because of its. I mean, it doesn't have to be deflationary just because of the fact that it's a very volatile asset. It is definitely not centrally controlled by any kind of like government to keep its value in check. It is extremely volatile against everything pretty much. So if you look at it, ETH as well, as I just said, like a store of value collateral asset, then things start kind of coming into view, because what are ETH's main value propositions or value use cases? Sorry, I should say. One of them, staking. Now, staking is essentially putting up a sort of collateral, a sort of bond, essentially saying that you're going to, earn these ETH rewards by validating the network, and you're not using your ETH to do anything else except as a stake, essentially, right? Literally a stake in the network to kind of like put up this bond, and if you do anything wrong, you'll get slashed. The second biggest kind of use case is that it's used as collateral within DeFi. For example, like there's 9 million ETH there being used to back up things like in a money market, being used as collateral so people can borrow stable coins in a kind of exchange like Uniswap, being used as liquidity for different pairs and things like that. That is a form of kind of collateral where you're putting it up and people can trade that collateral and things like that against other pairs. And then the third thing, as you mentioned, is fees. Now, I really think that people, regardless of if ETH is going up or not, people are still going to spend it on fees because they're doing things on the network that mean more to them than what the fee is at that current period of time, for example. Like, and I think that's going to persist. I don't think people are going to stop doing that because of essentially because they know that it's going to be more valuable. I haven't actually spoken to anyone that kind of thinks like that. But on that point, maybe there are people out there, but on that point, we also have like layer twos coming along, which are going to charge for transaction fees, but are going to charge much, much less as well. So it's going to be even less of a kind of hit. It's like a credit card fee, essentially, right? Where you're kind of like spending extra money to use a credit card, but the convenience of it and the value of the purchase is worth more to you than holding on to those dollars. And I know it's different to ETH, but still, like, those dollars are still going to just a fee that, realistically is just like, you don't want to pay that if you don't have to, but you pay it because you're happy with the service that you're being provided with, which is credit. Just like with Ethereum, you're happy that you can do a transaction on Ethereum and you're happy to pay those fees. But there's also the concept of like meta transactions where you can pay fees in stable coins. Yes, at the base layer, it's paid in ETH, but you don't see that. You're just paying the fee in your stablecoin, and that goes through a kind of routing system that pays it in ETH. So there's a lot of that going on as well. So yeah, to get back to, I guess, like the point, the best way to think about ETH, is a programmable kind of store of value collateral asset where people will buy it and hold it and hold it because they expect it's going to go up in the future, but they also use it. Like we've seen the utility of ETH just explode. I mean, they're not just hoarding it; they're using it as within DeFi. They're using it in staking. They're using it to pay fees, all that sort of stuff. They're even using it as money still with the NFT ecosystem. I know people, long term, that's probably not going to be a solution because more and more people will clue into the fact that, oh wow, I need to hold on to my ETH because it's going to go up in value, and it's going to be bad for me to buy these NFTs with it. So I expect the NFT economy to kind of go towards a stablecoin kind of economy as well, which brings me to my probably last point on this one. I know this can go a lot deeper, but I wanted to kind of give a high level here. But the last point is that because ETH is an amazing collateral asset, we can build currencies on top of the ETH as collateral, right? We've seen that happen with DAI. I know DAI has other collateral types now, but it's still a lot of ETH in there. We've seen that happen with something like RAI, which is actually not pegged to a fiat currency. It's pegged to itself and trying to achieve stability through itself. We've seen plenty of other experiments happen within stable assets and stable coins and stuff like that being backed with ETH as collateral. So I think we're going to see more and more of that happening, and I think that's actually the path forward, because you tap into ETH as what it actually is, which is a really cool collateral asset, rather than as a currency, and then you build currencies on top of it. And that way, the design space for building a new currency is absolutely massive. We don't have to limit ourselves to essentially saying, okay, well, how do we basically meme ETH into a currency, or how do we make ETH a currency when we can't control what ETH is? Like, you can't control the monetary policy of ETH, you can't control the levers of it, you can't do any of that. But as an app developer or someone who wants to develop a new stable coin or whatever, you can set the parameters, and we can have thousands of experiments run in parallel, we're using ETH as collateral, and then we can choose the best currencies that we want to use. So I think it's still early days, but as long as people maybe stop thinking about ETH as a currency, it kind of comes into view the design space that opens up when you think about ETH as like a collateral asset.
Gotcha. I do want to switch gears to a great question from the audience from Harsh. He basically asks, is proof of stake more centralizing than proof of work? Because as a proof of stake participant, you don't have to sell your rewards to cover mining costs. And I think you're a great person to answer this, because you have a validator running in the background. I'm not sure if the audience can see it now, but you're obviously in the never sell ETH camp. In 50 years' time, your validator is still chugging along. There's very little cost associated with that. Where does that leave the distribution of ETH in the future?
Yeah, so this is a great question. I think I would kind of push back that people don't have to sell their rewards for a few different reasons. One of them is taxes. Like, people are going to have to sell their rewards to cover taxes. So there will be ETH being sold regardless. You can probably, people can probably set up in jurisdictions where taxes are friendlier. But, if you're an individual staker, you're not going to go have a company in the Cayman Islands to avoid taxes, right? You're going to pay those taxes, and there's going to be a lot of taxes paid out of that. So I think that's one reason why people would sell. Secondly, people are incurring an opportunity cost as well by staking their ETH, because if their ETH is being staked, they can't use that ETH for various different things. There are kind of derivatives that you can use in the future where you'll be able to kind of like have a tokenized representation of your stake and stuff like that. But I'm not going to go down that rabbit hole. It's another question there. But there's still an opportunity cost incurred. There are still costs in general. They're nowhere near as high as proof of work mining, but there is still kind of like tons of costs associated with electricity, hardware, time at the end of the day, making sure everything's running smoothly, and if anything goes wrong and sort of things like that, you have to kind of look into that and make sure everything's running smoothly. But then there's also the fact that people will sell because the price goes up too. Like, they're going to take profits. Maybe they say to themselves, oh, I don't want to stake anymore. Like, this is worth a lot of money now. I'm going to sell and kind of like exit here. And I think that, yes, obviously with proof of work, it's a lot more expensive. More and more coins kind of get distributed into the ecosystem. But I think that Ethereum has already had like a really great distribution phase where Ethereum has existed as a proof of work network for it'll be 7 years by the time the merge goes through, and Ethereum and ETH was sold during an ICO that was open to everyone. It's also been distributed over multiple market cycles where you've had lots of different participants run through, where people sold, people bought, like at different price points, and you have like a really, really healthy distribution of ETH at this point in time. So I think on that front, distribution comes into the play when you think about these things too. It's like, how distributed is the stake, for example? Like, is it in the hands of people that have kind of like bought lower, bought higher? And it is. It's both. It really is both at the end of the day. And will these people sell? Will they buy? There's tons of people who will sell. Like, there's not many people, I think, that are in the never kind of like sell camp like I am. There's a lot of people who are staking because they want to earn an ETH denominated reward. But then when the price goes high enough, they're going to sell, and they're going to sell for the same reason that everyone else sells, because they've made profits and they want to cash out some. And I don't think that changes whether it's proof of work or proof of stake, but there is a valid argument to be made that obviously miners have to sell at least a large portion of their kind of like what they've mined back into the market. But mining has become such an efficient kind of industry now, and that these miners, they really do suck out a lot of value without having to sell much to cover costs. You can actually monitor this on chain. Their costs, while they are high and they do have to sell like a fair bit, depending on what the price of like a coin is at any given time, and all the hedging options they have as well, they can essentially, what they can actually do is that they can hedge their positions with futures market. So they can long short if they want to, and then keep the spot, keep the BTC, while still protecting themselves against downsides and upsides, and then sell only what they need to cover costs. So I think, while things are different and there's a few different intricacies between the two, I don't think it's a huge issue that people, are staking and people are essentially holding on to their ETH longer than they would if they were mining. And also on top of that, ETH has so many other use cases as well that people won't want to miss out on that either. Like I haven't staked all of my ETH because I'm still using a lot of it within DeFi, for example. And, we just have, and like with, say for Bitcoin, for example, you can't really do much else with your BTC. You can use a centralized exchange to kind of do stuff with it, or you can basically bring it over to Ethereum and do stuff with it, but it's still like centralizing. If you want it to remain kind of like decentralized, then you use ETH on Ethereum, and you use ETH within staking. It just becomes like part of someone's, I guess, portfolio, like staking or running a validator sort of thing. So yeah, hopefully that kind of like answers the question.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So I did want to ask a question that's somewhat personal to myself now. So I'm sure you're familiar with a project called Gelato. I'm working on a similar project called Brink. There are some core differences there, but essentially we're creating a protocol for executing automated orders in DeFi, specifically on Ethereum. And so this would work by, there's a proxy account that a user has full ownership over, has full custody over. We obviously never have custody, and Gelato wouldn't either. And a network of executors is constantly monitoring these signed orders that the users have put out, and they're always watching to see if they can execute that order on the user's behalf. I'm curious what you think of this. Do you think this could potentially be the future? Is this a way to limit MEV as well? One of the things we're thinking about a lot is that if you actually think about it, it seems very intensive that an end user would be interacting directly with Uniswap on the blockchain level. We think perhaps all of that could be automated away in the future with proxy accounts. So I wanted to hear if you've researched Gelato before, if you have any thoughts there, etc.
Yeah, I've seen the projects for sure, and I think that you're right. Most end users are not going to be directly interacting with these things when we achieve like that mass adoption that we're kind of going for. I think most end users will be using proxy services. There'll be tons of services built on top of these protocols and tapping into them and giving users different kind of features and abilities and different kind of ways to do things. So, and that's simply because at the end of the day, as much as maybe I would hate to admit it, like I know the reality of the fact is most people want just very simple things. They don't want to have to kind of like do anything complex. A lot of people don't actually want to be their own bank. No, they don't really care too much about like their finances day to day. They just want to have like a simple service that earns them a yield, for example. Like if a service comes along and says, hey, you can earn a 10% yield on your stable coins, put it, do it with us, and they use like a proxy contract to do that. Well, that's what a lot of people are going to do. And if there's a nice interface for them to tap into, a really kind of and a trusted brand that they trust with their funds, even if it's non-custodial, they're still trusting them to do everything okay. Then they're going to use that service. And same goes for something that you were talking about, like Gelato or Brink or whatever else, with like giving users the ability to do things like limit orders and stuff like that. Yeah, they're going to use these tools. Like if it's providing value to them, if it's something that automates the process for them and makes their lives easier, then they're going to use it. Because as humans, we take the path of least resistance a lot of the time, and the path of least resistance to interacting with DeFi protocols is to do it through a proxy, is to do it through a brand that you trust, is to do it through a tool that makes it just super easy. Like literally 1 to 2 clicks is it. Because if we look at the Web 2 world, the most successful products are the ones that limit the amount of clicks that users have to go through to use the main product, especially the apps on an iPhone. Like if I have to click more than a few different times, I definitely, I'm not going to use the app as much as something that I only have to click a couple of times. So I think that there's a lot of apps out there doing this, like Argent and Rainbow and Dharma and things like that are offering these services. They act as, I guess, like a proxy for sure, and they act as sometimes a middleman, depending if they're centralized or stuff like that, and taking a fee. But users are going to use it. Like there's me and you as power users, and then there's like the rest of the world, which is not power users, and
Yeah.
that's fine. I just think that what's cool about it is the fact that we have a choice, because this is the main difference between DeFi and traditional finance, is that within traditional finance, you don't have a choice. You have to go through proxies. You have to go through middlemen. You have absolutely no say or whatever in how that's handled. You literally go to the bank, they do it for you. Whereas with DeFi, you can use a proxy, you can use a crypto bank, you can use whatever you want. Or you can go directly to the source, go directly to the smart contract and do it yourself. Yes, it's a bit more involved, but you have the choice in doing that. That to me is the key innovator of DeFi, rather than everyone having to interact directly with the protocols and be fully decentralized themselves. No, I think that as long as the choice exists, as long as the power users or the people who want to be more involved can still access that directly, I think that is the bull case really for DeFi at the end of the day.
Great, thank you. One thing that I've been thinking about a lot is, will all of these infrastructure products, basically the main DeFi products right now, become commodities in the future? One example of this is Curve. Obviously, it's a fantastic product for soft pegged assets. But of course, it's incentivized. So what happens? I guess the question is, what happens the day after those incentives stop? There's so little intellectual property protection in this space. An anonymous team can fork the code and create a new governance token. What happens when those incentives are no longer available? Does someone just copy Curve, and what happens to the governance token holders of Curve?
Yeah, so there's a lot more that goes into a product than just its code. I think the network effects like span multiple different things. So I think legitimacy plays a big part in this. You know, if someone forks Curve, and they did fork it, I mean, there was Swerve and things like that back in the day, they all died off. They're nowhere near as legitimate as Curve. Like, people know Curve, it has brand awareness, it has trust from users. It's completely legitimate. Like, they know that the team's not going to rug them. They trust them more than another team, whatever, right? And that's a huge part. And I think why we see these protocols that get forked don't lose to their forks. I mean, even Uniswap, it still dominates compared to SushiSwap. And I know SushiSwap has a whole ecosystem, but just looking at their exchange, the AMM, Uniswap still does at least 10 times more volume than it, and it has no liquidity mining rewards either, whereas SushiSwap does. So when you look at when you kind of look at that, you can it kind of comes into view that really you can't just fork a project and steal all their liquidity at the end of the day. Like, it's not, and you can't do it over the long term. Maybe short term you can do it depending on what the market conditions are and if people are like FOMOing in or whatever. But long term, you need legitimacy, you need integrations, which is incredibly important. Legitimacy brings integrations. Like, one of those proxies we were just talking about aren't going to integrate with fork XYZ of Uniswap. They're going to integrate with Uniswap because that's legitimate. Like, they know that it is the one they can trust. They know that the smart contracts haven't been messed with. They know that the brand awareness is there, and all that sort of stuff, and they trust it. So those are the two major things that I think people kind of miss, is that the legitimacy of the product services the rest of like how the ecosystem views it, and integrations are incredibly important because of that. And a lot of people will, as I said, interact with these things through proxies, and as I said, these proxies aren't going to integrate with projects that they think are just forks, or they think that aren't legitimate and they don't trust. So I think that is a big thing that a lot of people miss when they see, this thing got forked, it's going to essentially lose out to its fork because this fork has X, Y, and Z. It has liquidity mining, it has this, it has that. And maybe in the short term, it's true that this fork gains some liquidity because liquidity is really fast to move. But it's essentially, the way I like to think about it, it's like if you have like a kind of like an animal that has like a family around it where they've just like have kids or whatever, and then the kids see like an opportunity far away, like, oh my god, there's so much food over there, I'm gonna go eat over there, right? They'll go eat over there, they'll have their fill, but then they'll come back to their den, right? Because their den is where they're protected, it's what's legitimate to them. It is essentially where they know, they trust. They don't trust this other thing. Like, they can't be outside for too long. And you actually see liquidity doing this, where it'll be like mercenary and be like, okay, well, I'm gonna go farm this because this is where I can get more rewards. And then like, oh, I don't want to be here for too long, I'm scared, and they come back to home base. So maybe that's a bit of an out there analogy, but I think if you actually look at the flows of liquidity across Ethereum, this has played out countless times with these forks. So that's how I kind of view it. And to your original question about like what happens when liquidity incentives run out on Curve or wherever else, I think that the other things kick in a lot stronger, like the legitimacy, the integrations, and that's how Curve will keep its network effect and liquidity, just like how Uniswap has kept it as well. It's just, I mean, integrations is the biggest thing, I think, because it builds the network effect more than anything else.
Gotcha. Great. For the live audience, if you have any questions, last minute questions, now is the time to send them. We have 10 minutes left. So definitely send those last ones. I have a couple more, just quick, fun questions. I'm curious, are there any like underrated projects that you're interested in that you maybe not haven't discussed yet, or just something we should keep our eye out for?
There's so much going on right
There
now.
are,
It's hard to pick a one project. Maybe I can kind of like just pick a sector that I kind of am starting to dive more into, and that's I guess social tokens. So I know social tokens. A lot of them look like scams because of the fact that it's just people trying to monetize their audience or whatever, and things like that. But there are a few out there that look really, really cool and really act as great coordination mechanisms for people's communities. So for example, if you have a community of people and you want them to have buy-in to what you're doing and you want to share, I guess, like your network effect with them, then you can issue this token, and then you can basically have this as a coordination mechanism where the token could accrue value from the work that you're doing, for example, as like a revenue source, or it could act as a way to get people involved with you and to build a community around it and to like feed into a DAO as well, because they kind of go hand in hand. So that's one space I'm definitely keeping an eye on. It's still so early. It is definitely not anywhere near maturity, but I think it falls into this whole creator economy that's being kind of, I guess, brought to life on Ethereum, where you have all these creators who typically have these centralized platforms that they use that extract all the value out of them. Whereas with a decentralized platform, they can essentially have a lot of that value flowing back to themselves. Now, the perfect example of this is something like a music artist or something, or an artist that produces music. They lose a lot of their revenue to these centralized platforms who take a massive cut, and they don't really have much say over what happens on these platforms. Whereas with a decentralized one, they can have more say, and they can like hold most of the revenue for themselves or keep most of it for themselves. And if they wanted to, they can issue a social token on top of that and then extend that revenue out to their fans and have their fans buy in, fund different projects, get revenue because of those projects, and basically collapse it down and take out that center, which is like Spotify or Apple Music or whatever, and make the community the center, so that we kind of like get that network effect of community kind of playing out, and they get the rewards as much as the artist gets the rewards for this. Because at the end of the day, the artist wouldn't be anything without their community. The community is what gives the art value, essentially, whether it be like art, like traditional art, or like music, or like film or whatever. And these centralized platforms really, at the end of the day, yes, they act as distribution mechanisms, but they also act as leeches, because they just leech off value without doing much of anything. And so if we can flip that on its head, if we can remove those middlemen and make the community the distribution vehicle, then we can create something really, really special, I think.
Awesome. Great. The last question, a very fun question. I'm curious if you have a favorite Ethereum memory. For me, it's kind of a sore subject. I actually got involved in this space about a year and a half ago when everyone was locking down with COVID. So I haven't been to any crypto event at all, no Bitcoin event, no Ethereum events. So I'm curious if you have a favorite Ethereum memory that sticks out for you.
Yeah, I guess there's a few. I mean, I'm the same as you. I haven't been to an Ethereum conference in a while. I mean, in the second half of 2019, I was going to like as many as I could. It was
Yeah.
one of the best times of my life, really. Those are the most fun things to go to, the ETH conferences. But in terms of like what I think is the memory, and I guess like the happiest I was within the Ethereum community is when the Beacon chain launched on December 1st, 2020, because it represented the culminative work of like 6 years of research and development within Ethereum. It basically killed all of the FUD around Ethereum's proof of stake can never work. It's never going to launch. It killed all of that FUD instantly, which was a sigh of relief for me, because I'd had to fight with people about it for many years. But it was just the first time I could do what I first got into Ethereum to do, and that was to stake. Like I actually originally bought ETH because I was like, oh wow, I can stake this eventually. I'm gonna scoop this up, because there was no DeFi back then, right? There was in 2017, there was very limited amounts of DeFi going on. It wasn't a big thing. There was only ICOs and stuff like that were big, and NFTs weren't even a thing or anything until like late 2017. So for me, the original reason of buying ETH was to stake it. So being able to stake it after waiting so long to do so, and to finally see that go live, and see it go live in such a grand fashion too, where everything worked perfectly. Like there was no kind of like hiccups with it. We launched perfectly. Everything works as it should. That was probably the best moment in Ethereum for me. I was awake for that as well. Like, it happened during waking hours for me, which was great. But essentially, just coming together with all my friends that I'd made over the years, we had like a call going and things like that, and just celebrating it. Yeah, it was just awesome. It was euphoric. I mean, like the price movements can make you euphoric, but I think for me, like the tech movements make me euphoric as well.
That's great. No, I wish I was there. In any case, I guess we'll close it off there. Thank you all so much. Thank you, Anthony. I'm sure most of you are familiar with him, but I've linked his information below if you want to check him out. Again, the Daily Gwei has been an incredible resource for me. I feel like it just makes me smarter every day when I watch it Monday through Friday. So definitely check that out. If you like the content, you can also check out my YouTube channel, see if there's any videos there, subscribe, etc. Other than that, thank you so much, Anthony. We really appreciate having you on, and we thank you for your time.
Yeah, thanks for having me on, Justin. And I just say to everyone who hasn't subscribed to Justin's channel yet, be sure to do so. I mean, he does a lot of great work with beginner tutorials and things like that. Like, and I'm happy to support anyone who's doing education like that. So yeah, definitely subscribe to him too.
Thank you, Anthony. All right. Well